So this is a map most people don't recognize. It's not a map that we see in our everyday experiences, but this map really privileges Indigenous peoples' relationships to their lands and language. And so you see the language families and the language groups within those families through these lines. And so they're fuzzy boundaries because our boundaries weren't the same as nation state boundaries where you had a definitive property line, because we believed in mutual reciprocity, in relationships and responsibilities. And so often, we shared territories. We would agree to disagree. We had our own forms of treaty, and we would be looking at our relationships. And so a lot of our children, for example, the Tunacha that you see down here, if I can use the pointer, right? So this is would have been our territory here. And so we often had children marry in, we would often have people married and have children with nation members from other nations, and that continues today. And so as we're in the modern treaty today, we're looking at relational identity issues, whereas we have nation members who are Tinacha, but they're also Nuchanawith, or they might be Shimshan, or they might be Shuswap, they might be Thompson, they might be Okanagan, or Anishinaabe. And so we don't believe in this definitive idea that you can only be one identity. And so we're really looking at how our languages and our geographies impact our identities and who we are in our homelands, and how that impacts our health. And so this is just a blow-up picture. For example, UBC is here in Musqueam territory. And so when people talk to me, for example, as a Tunacha person, as a Tunacha Pathki, I'm actually not an urban Indian, because the urban context actually implies that the Musqueam people have no rights or jurisdiction, no inherent relationship to this land, and when in fact they do, and it's called Vancouver. And so for myself and for my children, we say we are Tunacha living in Musqueam territory. And you see the diversity of languages within this map. This is the Coast Salish language group. But when you really start taking a look, you see the diversity of languages as well as geographies. So you see more mountainous area here, more flats here, right, closer to the ocean. This would be, salmon running upriver, and then you see the island, right? So there's a lot of diversity, and that's a really important piece to consider when we think about colonial impacts, when we think about impacts to health and social adversities and health disparities. So a lot of the issues that we're dealing with are directly related back to processes of colonization, and I'm not going to get into it very deeply, but I do want to bring to your attention the idea of the provision of low quality social services, which usually health is constructed within the low quality social services. Many nations have received health transfer. The First Nations Health Authority, of course, is taking over Health Canada services, but also active in supporting nation-determined, community-based opportunities for different nations, such as my own, the Tanacha Nation determined, and then our communities, Acham, Akiskanook, Yakanauki, and Tobacco Plains, to consider how they might address their issues and what their goals for dealing with colonialism are. And so this is what colonialism looks like geographically and linguistically when we think about First Nations, and we look at Canada and we see this the designation of the different provinces and territories, and then how we've been taught to see First Nations people or Aboriginal people. And we've been taught to see them as on reserve and off reserve, and it's a complete denial of the relationship to lands. And so this is a really important consideration, especially in the geopolitical boundaries of British Columbia, because we are not completely a treaty province. And so nations such as my own, which you see in this little area here, right? So there's communities in here, are considered now reserve, and we are in the treaty process, and we're going through that process of reclaiming what's ours and understanding how we can positively impact health for a life lived long and well. And so this is what it really looks like. And Neil MacLeod talks about it. He's a Cree scholar, and he talks about the ideological and spatial diaspora. And what he talks about is this disconnection from our knowledge base. And as we know in Western sciences, everything speaks to, if you have a strong and healthy identity, from birth onwards, you are a strong and healthy individual later in life, and you build resiliency, and you have better, opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. And so for Indigenous peoples, it's really important to recognize that both of these different situations are happening upon us. So when people talk, for example, about, call me an Aboriginal person, and I say, well, I'm an Aboriginal person if you want to talk about my constitutional rights. I'm a First Nations person if you want to talk about, band politics and these sorts of things. I'm an Indian if you want to start talking about the Indian Act and how that impacts my life from birth to death. But I'm Tunaqa. That's who I am. I'm Tunaqa, and I have my name for who I am and the social relationships that way. And so it's not just one identity, but it could be multi-layer identity. And of course, Aboriginal identity has a very, very different socialization than, for example, Tunaqa, being a Tunaqa Pashki. So looking at how this might impact health, how this might impact ethics, how this might impact your methodologies, how this might actually impact how your research gets taken up, if it gets taken up. So it's very popular to try to homogenize us as all the same. As First Nations, right, or as Métis, or as Inuit, but even within our populations, there's quite heterogeneity about who we are, the languages we speak, the geographies we are attached to, and how we carry ourselves. And so this is my home territory, and as you see, it moves into Washington, Idaho, and Montana. And that predates treaty, that predates, the 49th parallel, that predates British Columbia and Alberta, and it goes back tens of thousands of years. And we have the archaeological evidence, and we have, et cetera, we have place names. We still go to these areas, we still have traditional knowledge, and we still act according to those relationships. So the pink part, for example, is the area that we're currently involved in treaty negotiations. And that's the Canadian-British Columbia borders. And you see in the little inset here, this little picture, this is BC, and this is where we are located. But we continue to have our relationships with our people especially on the Flathead Reservation of Montana and in Bonners Ferry, Idaho. And so so this is a snapshot of what it's like to have that ideological and spatial diaspora, as well as have an inherent identity.